There are betrayals that break your heart. And then there are betrayals so deep that they change the way you look at every memory you've ever trusted. Imagine discovering that the two people you loved most in the world had spent years lying to you. Imagine realizing that every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every smile and every photograph was hiding a truth so devastating that it could destroy everything you thought you knew about your life. Now imagine finding out that while they were secretly planning a future together, they were unknowingly standing on ground that belonged entirely to you. One evening, inside a ballroom filled with wealthy investors, senior executives, and influential business leaders, a man stood on a stage celebrating what he believed was the greatest achievement of his career. Beside him stood the woman he had risked everything for. They smiled as the audience applauded. They believed they had finally won. They believed the past was behind them. They believed the woman they betrayed was gone forever. Then the doors opened. A single woman walked into the room. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't there to beg for answers. She was there to reveal a truth that would leave an entire room speechless. Within minutes, careers would collapse. Millions of dollars would change hands. A marriage would officially die. And two people who thought they controlled a powerful company would learn they never owned it in the first place. Because the woman they betrayed wasn't just a heartbroken wife. She was the hidden majority owner of the very company they were celebrating. And they had absolutely no idea. This is the story of Olivia Carter, a woman who trusted her husband, a woman who trusted her best friend, and a woman who discovered that betrayal can sometimes become the greatest advantage of all. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first glance, Olivia Carter's life appeared almost perfect. She lived comfortably, enjoyed a successful career, and shared what many people believed was a strong and lasting marriage with her husband, Richard Carter. Richard was respected in business circles. He was confident, ambitious, and exceptionally skilled at making people trust him. For more than 20 years, they built a life together. Friends admired them. Colleagues respected them. Neighbors pointed to them as an example of a successful couple who had figured life out. But there was someone else who had become part of Olivia's world long before the betrayal began. Melissa Brooks. If Olivia trusted anyone outside her family, it was Melissa. The two women had spent years side by side through milestones, celebrations, challenges, and personal victories. Melissa wasn't simply a friend. She was family in every way except blood. She knew Olivia's secrets. She knew her fears. She knew her dreams. There was a time when Olivia would have trusted Melissa with absolutely anything. And that was exactly what made what happened next so difficult to understand. Because stories like this rarely begin with obvious warning signs. They begin with small moments. A conversation that feels slightly different. A glance that lasts a little too long. An excuse that doesn't quite make sense. The kind of details most people ignore because they trust the people around them. For years, Olivia ignored those details. She had no reason not to. After all, why would she ever suspect her husband and her closest friend? Why would she imagine that the two people she trusted most were keeping secrets from her? And why would she believe that those secrets extended far beyond an affair? Because what Olivia was about to uncover wasn't simply a story about infidelity. It was a story about greed, power, ambition, and a hidden truth that had been sitting right in front of everyone for years. A truth so shocking that when it finally came to light, Richard and Melissa would realize they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. And it all started with a detail so small that almost nobody would have noticed it. That detail appeared on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There was nothing remarkable about the day itself. Olivia had spent most of the morning handling routine matters before meeting Melissa for lunch at a restaurant they had visited countless times over the years. The conversation felt normal. They talked about work, family, mutual friends, and upcoming events. Melissa laughed at the right moments. She asked thoughtful questions. She seemed exactly like the friend Olivia had always known. But halfway through the conversation, Melissa casually mentioned that Richard would be flying to Denver the following week for a business meeting. At first, Olivia didn't react. Then something felt off. Richard had never mentioned any trip to Denver. In fact, just the night before, he had told her he expected to spend the entire week in Chicago preparing for an important presentation. The contradiction was small, so small that most people would have ignored it. Olivia almost did. Almost. When she returned home that evening, she asked Richard about it. The response came instantly. Too instantly. He laughed and explained that Melissa must have misunderstood something he had mentioned weeks earlier. According to him, there was no Denver trip. The explanation sounded reasonable, and yet something about the way he answered stayed with her. It wasn't what he said. It was how quickly he said it, almost as though he had already prepared the response before hearing the question. For the first time in years, Olivia felt a slight crack form in the certainty she had always carried about her marriage. Days passed. Life continued. But once a question enters your mind, it becomes difficult to ignore. Soon Olivia began noticing other things. Tiny things. Richard became unusually protective of his phone. Messages appeared and disappeared before she could read them. Business meetings seemed to multiply. Last-minute trips became more common. Conversations grew shorter. There was always another call to take, another meeting to attend, another reason he couldn't spend time at home. None of these things proved anything. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they created a pattern. And patterns have a way of revealing truths people work very hard to hide. Then came another moment, one that was impossible to dismiss. Several weeks later, Olivia attended a charity fundraiser with Melissa. During the event, Melissa excused herself to take a phone call. It wasn't unusual. People stepped away from conversations all evening. What caught Olivia's attention was the expression on Melissa's face. She smiled. Not the polite smile people give acquaintances. Not the smile of someone handling business. It was different, warmer, more personal, more intimate. As Melissa walked away, Olivia noticed something else. The name on the phone screen. She didn't see the entire name. Only enough letters to recognize the first initial. Again, it could have meant nothing. There are thousands of people whose names begin with R. But the uneasy feeling returned. Stronger this time. For the next several days, Olivia tried convincing herself she was imagining things. She reminded herself of all the years she had trusted these people. She reminded herself that suspicion can make ordinary situations appear meaningful. She reminded herself that friendships and marriages cannot survive if every action is questioned. Yet despite every attempt to dismiss her concerns, the questions remained. And then something happened that made those questions impossible to ignore. One evening, Richard told Olivia he would be attending a late corporate dinner with investors. It wasn't unusual. His position required frequent networking events. He left shortly after 6 o'clock. Around 8 that evening, Olivia received a message from Melissa. A simple text. Melissa apologized for being unavailable earlier and explained she was spending a quiet evening at home, catching up on television. Again, nothing seemed unusual. Until nearly midnight, Olivia couldn't sleep. She wandered through social media before stumbling across a photo posted by someone attending a downtown restaurant opening. The image showed dozens of guests mingling throughout the venue. Most people would have scrolled past it without a second thought. Olivia stopped. Near the edge of the photo, partially hidden by other guests, stood Richard. Beside him stood Melissa. Neither knew they had been photographed. Neither appeared to be attending separate events. Neither appeared surprised to see the other. They looked comfortable. Very comfortable. The kind of comfort that only exists when two people have spent significant time together. Olivia stared at the image for a long time. She zoomed in, then zoomed in again. Part of her hoped she was wrong. Part of her prayed there was a reasonable explanation. But deep down, another part already knew. The next morning she called Melissa. Melissa answered immediately. Olivia casually asked how her evening had been. The answer arrived without hesitation. Quiet. I stayed home all night. The lie was effortless, confident, natural, and that frightened Olivia more than anything else. Because honest people occasionally make mistakes. Liars rehearse. For the first time, Olivia began considering a possibility she never thought she would face. What if her husband and best friend were hiding something together? The question haunted her. Weeks passed. The evidence remained circumstantial. Nothing was definitive. Nothing was undeniable. Yet every instinct told her the truth was getting closer. Then one morning, while organizing paperwork in Richard's home office, she discovered something tucked inside a folder. A hotel receipt. Not unusual by itself. Richard traveled frequently. But this receipt was different. The date matched a weekend when Richard claimed to be attending a corporate retreat. A retreat Olivia later confirmed had never happened. The location matched a luxury resort nearly 200 miles away. And according to the reservation, there were accommodations for 2 guests. Olivia sat silently holding the document. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled. For months, she had searched for reassurance. For months, she had hoped she was wrong. Now, for the first time, she found herself wondering whether the truth was even worse than she imagined. Because if Richard and Melissa were willing to lie about where they were going, what else were they hiding? And as Olivia would soon discover, the affair was only the beginning. The real secret involved money, power, and a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A company that Richard and Melissa believed was becoming theirs. A company they were already making plans to control. What they didn't realize was that every step they took toward that goal was bringing them closer to a revelation that would eventually destroy everything they thought they had won. For several days after finding the hotel receipt, Olivia told no one what she had discovered. She didn't confront Richard. She didn't call Melissa. She didn't confide in friends or family. Instead, she did something that would later change the entire outcome of the story. She watched. People often assume that betrayal is exposed through dramatic confrontations and emotional arguments. In reality, many secrets reveal themselves when the people hiding them become comfortable. The longer deception continues without consequences, the more careless people become. Olivia understood that. Years of experience in business had taught her that information is often more valuable than immediate action. So she remained silent. And silence, as it turned out, became her greatest advantage. Over the next few weeks, she paid attention to details she would have previously ignored. Richard's schedule suddenly became much easier to understand when she stopped accepting every explanation at face value. Meetings that supposedly lasted until midnight often ended much earlier. Business trips frequently contained unexplained gaps. There were stretches of time where nobody seemed to know exactly where he was. Melissa's behavior changed as well. Whenever Richard's name came up in conversation, there was a subtle shift in her tone. It was small enough that most people would never notice it. But once Olivia became aware of it, she couldn't stop seeing it. The two of them had grown careless. They believed they were safe, and that belief would prove costly. One afternoon, Olivia made a decision she never imagined she would have to make. She hired a private investigator. The choice wasn't easy. Part of her still hoped she was wrong. Part of her hoped there was some misunderstanding that would make all her suspicions seem foolish. But another part of her needed certainty. She needed facts. And facts, unlike emotions, couldn't be argued away. The investigator was a former law enforcement professional with decades of experience handling infidelity and corporate fraud cases. During their first meeting, he listened carefully as Olivia explained everything she had observed. When she finished, he asked a simple question. Do you want the truth, even if it's worse than you expect? Olivia answered without hesitation. Yes. The investigation began immediately. Days turned into weeks. Then the first report arrived. It was worse than Olivia imagined. Photographs confirmed repeated meetings between Richard and Melissa. Not occasional encounters. Not innocent lunches. Repeated meetings. Hotels. Private dinners. Weekend trips. Long periods spent together while both claimed to be elsewhere. The evidence removed all doubt. The affair was real. And according to the investigator's timeline, it had likely been happening for nearly 2 years. 2 years. 24 months of lies. 24 months of pretending. 24 months of looking Olivia in the eye while hiding a completely different life. For a long time, she simply sat alone reviewing the photographs. The emotional pain was difficult enough. But another question kept bothering her. Why? Why would Richard risk everything? Why would Melissa betray a friendship that had lasted decades? An affair explained part of the story. It didn't explain all of it. There was something else. Something larger. Something neither of them wanted Olivia to discover. That suspicion grew stronger when the investigator delivered his second report. This report had very little to do with romance. It focused on business. Specifically, conversations, meetings, documents. and unusual financial activity connected to the company where Richard held an executive leadership position. At first glance, the transactions appeared ordinary. But when viewed together, a different picture emerged. Richard and Melissa weren't simply spending time together. They were planning, strategizing, discussing future leadership changes, talking about company ownership, talking about expansion plans, talking about restructuring decisions. The more Olivia read, the more confused she became. Because Richard wasn't speaking like an executive employee. He was speaking like someone who believed he would soon control the company itself. That didn't make sense. Or at least, it shouldn't have. The company had a complicated ownership structure dating back years. Richard understood part of it. Very few people understood all of it. The deeper Olivia looked into what he was doing, the more she realized he had made a dangerous assumption. Richard believed he knew who held power. Richard believed he understood who controlled the company's future. Richard was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. And neither did Melissa. Several days later, Olivia met with the company's longtime legal advisor. The attorney had worked closely with her family for decades. If anyone knew the complete history of the company, it was him. When she explained her concerns, he listened carefully before opening a file that had not been reviewed in years. Inside were documents dating back to the company's earliest days. Ownership agreements, trust structures, investment records, private contracts. And as Olivia turned each page, memories of conversations with her late father began returning. Years earlier, when the company was still growing, her father had made a series of decisions designed to protect the business from future threats. At the time, Olivia hadn't fully appreciated the significance of those decisions. Now she finally understood. The company wasn't owned the way most people assumed. The public structure only told part of the story. Behind layers of trusts, holding entities, and legal agreements sat a controlling interest that remained largely invisible to outsiders. A controlling interest that represented far more than 50% of ownership. A controlling interest connected directly to Olivia. The attorney looked at her and quietly said something she would never forget. Richard may run the company, but he doesn't control it. Olivia remained silent. The attorney continued. To be completely accurate, he never did. The room suddenly felt very different. For weeks, Olivia had believed she was merely the victim in a story about betrayal. Now she was beginning to realize she occupied a very different position. Richard and Melissa thought they were building a future together. They thought they were positioning themselves to take over a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They thought Olivia was standing in their way. What they didn't understand was that the company they dreamed of controlling already belonged to her. Not partially, not symbolically, actually, legally, undeniably. And if the documents were correct, Olivia controlled more than 60% of the entire organization. The realization changed everything. For the first time since discovering the affair, she stopped feeling powerless. For the first time, she understood that Richard and Melissa weren't holding all the cards. In fact, they had been playing a game without even knowing who owned the board. Most people in Olivia's position would have confronted them immediately. Most people would have filed for divorce. Most people would have exposed the affair and walked away. But Olivia wasn't interested in emotional satisfaction. She wanted the complete truth. She wanted to know how far Richard and Melissa were willing to go. And most importantly, she wanted to understand what they planned to do once they believed they had finally removed her from the picture. So she made a decision. A decision that would ultimately lead to one of the most shocking boardroom confrontations anyone in that company had ever witnessed. She would say nothing. Not yet. Because what Richard and Melissa were planning next would reveal exactly who they really were. And once that happened, there would be no escaping the consequences. Keeping a secret is difficult. Keeping a secret while pretending everything is normal can feel almost impossible. Yet that was exactly what Olivia did. Every morning she woke up beside Richard as though nothing had changed. She listened to his stories about meetings and business trips. She attended social gatherings. She sat across from Melissa at lunches and charity events. She smiled when expected. She nodded during conversations. She maintained the same calm presence everyone had always known. Meanwhile, she was learning more than either of them could have imagined. The private investigator continued gathering information. The company's legal advisors quietly reviewed records. Financial experts examined transactions. Piece by piece, a much larger picture began to emerge. What Olivia discovered wasn't merely an affair. The affair had become the foundation for something else, something far more dangerous. Richard and Melissa had convinced themselves that the future belonged to them. And once people become convinced they deserve power, they often begin taking risks they would never have considered before. The first major warning sign appeared during a quarterly leadership meeting. Although Olivia wasn't physically present, she received detailed notes afterward. Several senior managers expressed concerns about a proposed expansion project that Richard strongly supported. The project required significant borrowing, aggressive projections, and substantial financial commitments. Normally, leadership teams debate such decisions carefully. Richard seemed unusually determined, more determined than anyone expected. When concerns were raised, he dismissed them. When risks were mentioned, he minimized them. When questions emerged, he treated them as obstacles rather than legitimate concerns. The behavior surprised many longtime employees. Richard had always been ambitious, but this felt different. It felt personal, as though he was rushing toward something, as though he believed time was running out. A few weeks later, Olivia learned why. The investigator uncovered messages between Richard and Melissa discussing their future together. The conversations were revealing. They talked about luxury homes, retirement plans, travel, investments, and most importantly, they talked about what would happen once Richard gained greater control over the company. Again and again, they referred to the business as though its future already belonged to them. The confidence was astonishing. Melissa discussed executive appointments she wanted to make. Richard discussed restructuring departments. They debated who should remain and who should be removed. They spoke like owners. The problem was simple. Neither of them actually owned the company, not in the way they believed. Yet because nobody had challenged their assumptions, they continued building plans based on a fantasy that was about to collide with reality. Months passed. The deeper Olivia looked, the more concerned she became. Not because Richard and Melissa were succeeding, but because they were making reckless decisions. Several respected employees were pushed aside. Experienced managers who questioned certain initiatives suddenly found themselves excluded from important discussions. People who had dedicated years to the company were being treated as obstacles. Meanwhile, individuals who supported Richard's vision were rewarded with promotions and influence. The culture inside the organization began changing. Employees noticed. Whispers spread through hallways. Longtime staff members quietly discussed their concerns. Morale declined. Trust weakened. The company was still profitable, but cracks were beginning to appear. Olivia watched all of it. Patiently, carefully. She understood something Richard did not. A successful company isn't built solely through ambition. It's built through trust. And trust, once damaged, is difficult to repair. Then came a development that accelerated everything. One evening, the investigator contacted Olivia with urgent news. Richard and Melissa had attended a private dinner with several investors. Normally, that wouldn't have been remarkable. What happened during the dinner was, according to multiple sources, Richard spoke openly about major leadership changes that would occur within the next year. He discussed future ownership as though it were already settled. He hinted that important transitions were coming. He described plans that exceeded the authority he actually possessed. The investors were impressed. The problem was that many of the promises he made depended on powers he didn't legally have. For Olivia, the dinner confirmed something important. Richard genuinely believed he was untouchable. He believed nobody could stop him. He believed he understood every important detail about the company. And that confidence was becoming increasingly dangerous. A week later, another discovery landed on Olivia's desk. This one left even the attorneys stunned. A confidential proposal, prepared by Richard, reviewed by Melissa. The document outlined a future restructuring strategy that would gradually concentrate decision-making authority around a small group of executives loyal to them. The proposal wasn't illegal, but it revealed their intentions with startling clarity. They weren't simply planning a future together. They were actively preparing to reshape the company around themselves. Olivia read the document twice, then a third time. Every page reinforced the same conclusion. Richard and Melissa had stopped thinking like employees. They had started thinking like rulers. The arrogance surprised her. But what surprised her even more was how little effort they made to verify their assumptions. They never questioned who ultimately controlled voting rights. They never investigated the hidden ownership structure. They never examined the legal protections established years earlier. They simply assumed power belonged to whoever appeared strongest in the moment. History is filled with people who made the same mistake, and it rarely ends well. As autumn approached, the company prepared for its annual executive gala. It was one of the most important events of the year. Investors attended, board members attended, executives attended, media representatives attended. The evening celebrated achievements, recognized leadership, and outlined future goals. Richard viewed the event as another opportunity to strengthen his position. Melissa viewed it as a glimpse of the future she believed was finally within reach. Neither realized that Olivia had already made a decision. She wasn't going to expose them privately. She wasn't going to confront them behind closed doors. She wasn't going to give them an opportunity to control the narrative. Instead, she was preparing something far more devastating. The legal team had completed its review. The ownership records were ready. The trust documents were verified. Board members had been quietly informed. Key stakeholders had received confidential updates. Everything was in place. Years of hidden ownership, months of investigation, countless lies, countless betrayals. All of it was moving toward a single moment, a single room, a single revelation. And when that revelation arrived, Richard and Melissa would finally discover a truth they never expected. The company they believed they were preparing to inherit had never been theirs at all. And very soon, they would learn exactly who had been watching them the entire time. The weeks leading up to the annual executive gala became some of the most revealing weeks Olivia had experienced since the investigation began. The closer Richard believed he was to achieving his goals, the more openly he talked about the future. At home, he seemed unusually confident. His mood improved. His patience increased. His stress appeared to disappear almost overnight. To anyone else, those changes might have seemed positive. To Olivia, they confirmed something important. Richard genuinely believed his plans were working. He believed he was approaching the finish line. What he didn't realize was that every step forward was bringing him closer to a wall he couldn't see. Melissa appeared equally confident. Friends noticed she had become more outspoken, more assertive, more comfortable discussing subjects she previously avoided. She spoke about future opportunities, new beginnings, fresh chapters, the kind of language people often use when they believe their lives are about to change dramatically. And in a way, they were right. Their lives were about to change, just not in the way they expected. While Richard and Melissa focused on the future they imagined, Olivia focused on facts. The legal team spent weeks preparing documentation. Every ownership agreement was reviewed. Every trust structure was verified. Every signature was authenticated. Every percentage point was confirmed. Nothing would be left open to interpretation. Nothing would be vulnerable to challenge. The board needed absolute clarity. The investors needed absolute clarity. And most importantly, Richard needed absolute clarity. Because after years of assumptions, the truth was finally going to be impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Olivia met privately with several longtime board members. Some had known her father. Others had worked alongside her family for decades. They listened carefully as the attorneys explained the ownership structure. The room became unusually quiet. Although many understood portions of the arrangement, few realized the full extent of Olivia's control. When the presentation ended, one board member leaned back in his chair and shook his head. For all these years, he said quietly, he never knew. The attorney simply nodded. No, he never knew. The comment lingered in the room. Not because Richard had been deceived. The information had always existed. The documents were legitimate. The records were available through proper channels. Richard simply never bothered looking beyond what he assumed to be true. And assumptions can become dangerous when they're mistaken for facts. Meanwhile, Richard continued building confidence among investors and executives. His speeches became bolder. His promises became larger. His vision became more ambitious. He talked about transformation, expansion, leadership, control. Again and again, he spoke as though the future already belonged to him. Many people believed him. Why wouldn't they? From the outside, Richard looked successful. He looked powerful. He looked like a man in complete command of his destiny. Appearances, however, can be misleading. A few days before the gala, Olivia received one final report from the investigator. It contained information she had been expecting but still found painful to read. Richard and Melissa had begun openly discussing marriage. Not publicly, not yet, but privately. They spoke about life after the divorce, life after the transition, Life after what they assumed would be a smooth transfer of influence and authority. The conversations revealed something that struck Olivia deeply. Neither expressed guilt. Neither expressed regret. Neither acknowledged the damage they had caused. Instead, they talked about their future as though Olivia were merely an obstacle that needed to be removed from the equation. A chapter to close. A problem to solve. The realization hurt. Not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed who they had become. The people she once loved no longer existed. The people she trusted had chosen ambition over loyalty, greed over gratitude, convenience over integrity. And now they would have to live with the consequences of those choices. The day of the gala finally arrived. By early evening, luxury vehicles lined the entrance of one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Executives arrived in formal attire. Investors greeted one another. Journalists circulated through the crowd. Champagne glasses sparkled beneath elegant chandeliers. The atmosphere was celebratory, optimistic, confident. No one in attendance understood that they were about to witness a moment that would be discussed for years afterward. Richard certainly didn't. He arrived looking completely at ease. His confidence was visible in every conversation. People congratulated him. They praised the company's recent performance. They spoke about future opportunities. He accepted every compliment with the calm assurance of a man who believed he was ascending to an even greater position. Melissa arrived shortly afterward. Throughout the evening, she remained close to Richard, careful enough to avoid drawing attention, comfortable enough to reveal their growing confidence. To most observers, nothing appeared unusual. The event proceeded exactly as expected. Dinner was served. Awards were presented. Speeches were delivered. Laughter echoed throughout the ballroom. Then came the final presentation of the evening. The presentation Richard had been anticipating for weeks. The one he viewed as another opportunity to solidify his standing. As he walked toward the stage, applause filled the room. He smiled, adjusted his jacket, thanked the audience, then began speaking about growth, about leadership, about the future. His words carried confidence. His delivery carried certainty. He spoke like a man who believed he knew exactly where his life was heading. For several minutes, everything unfolded exactly as he expected. Then the ballroom doors opened. The sound itself wasn't dramatic. A simple movement. A simple interruption. Yet somehow every head in the room turned. Every conversation stopped. Every eye shifted toward the entrance. And there stood Olivia Carter. Calm. Elegant. Unhurried. She wasn't supposed to be there. At least not according to Richard and Melissa. For a brief moment, confusion crossed Richard's face. Melissa appeared equally surprised. Neither understood why Olivia had arrived. Neither understood what was about to happen. But the attorneys standing beside her did. The board members seated near the front did. And within a matter of minutes, everyone else would understand as well. Because Olivia wasn't attending the gala to confront a cheating husband. She wasn't there to expose a secret relationship. She wasn't there seeking sympathy. She had come for something entirely different. She had come to reveal who actually owned the company. And the moment that truth entered the room, Richard and Melissa's world would begin collapsing in front of everyone they had spent years trying to impress. The ballroom remained silent. Not the ordinary silence that happens when a speech is interrupted. This was different. It was the kind of silence that settles over a room when people sense something important is about to happen, even if they don't yet understand what it is. Richard stood frozen near the podium. Melissa remained seated at her table. Investors exchanged confused glances. Executives whispered quietly among themselves. No one knew why Olivia had arrived, but everyone could feel that the evening had suddenly changed. Olivia walked forward with measured confidence. There was no anger in her expression, no dramatic display, no visible emotion, and somehow that made the moment even more unsettling. People expected outrage. They expected confrontation. They expected a wounded spouse seeking revenge. Instead, they saw a woman who appeared completely in control. When she reached the front of the ballroom, she stopped beside several attorneys and members of the board. Richard attempted a smile. It was brief, forced, uncertain. "Olivia," he said into the microphone, trying to maintain composure. "I wasn't expecting you tonight." The room waited. Olivia looked at him calmly. "I know," she replied. That was all she said. Yet the response seemed to make Richard even more uncomfortable. For the first time all evening, his confidence appeared to crack. A senior attorney stepped forward. Several assistants began distributing folders throughout the room. Board members opened them immediately. Investors followed. Confusion spread across their faces as they reviewed the documents. Richard watched nervously. Melissa leaned forward in her chair. Neither understood what they were looking at. The attorney waited until the room settled. Then he began speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, before tonight concludes, there are several important matters regarding company ownership and governance that must be formally addressed. The atmosphere shifted instantly. This was no longer a celebration. This had become something else entirely. Richard's expression tightened. The attorney continued. Recent reviews of company records, trust structures, shareholder agreements, and historical ownership documents have confirmed the controlling interest of this organization. Several people began turning pages. Others adjusted their glasses and reread sections. The further they read, the more surprised they appeared. Richard finally looked down at one of the folders. At first he seemed confused, then concerned, then visibly alarmed. Because the documents were saying something he had never expected to see. Something that directly contradicted everything he believed. The attorney spoke clearly. For many years, the majority ownership of this company has remained protected through a series of legal entities and family trusts established during the organization's earliest stages. A murmur moved through the room. Richard continued reading. His face lost color. Melissa stared at her own copy. Neither seemed able to process what they were seeing. The attorney reached the final page, then delivered the statement that changed everything. After verification of all controlling interests, voting rights, and ownership structures, it has been confirmed that Olivia Carter holds 61% of the company. The room exploded into whispers. Executives turned toward one another. Investors looked stunned. Several board members nodded quietly, already familiar with the findings. Richard simply stared. For a moment, he looked as though he hadn't heard correctly. Then he looked again, and again. Page after page led to the same conclusion. The company belonged to Olivia. Not partially, not symbolically, actually, legally, unequivocally. Years of assumptions vanished in seconds. Every future plan he had discussed, every strategy he had developed, every conversation about control, every vision he had created, all of it depended on a belief that was completely wrong. Across the ballroom, Melissa appeared equally shocked. She flipped through the documents repeatedly as though another answer might appear. It never did. The facts remained unchanged. Olivia controlled the company. Olivia controlled the voting power. Olivia controlled the future. And for years, neither of them had known. The attorney wasn't finished. There is an additional matter requiring immediate action. The room became quiet again. Everyone focused on the front of the ballroom. Several board members exchanged glances. Then formal resolutions were presented, one after another, each carefully prepared, each legally reviewed, each supported by documentation. Richard's breathing became visibly heavier as he realized where the process was heading. The first resolution addressed executive authority. The second addressed governance concerns. The third referenced conduct that potentially compromised leadership responsibilities. Then came the vote. Board members cast their decisions. Investors representing voting interests submitted their positions. The process moved quickly, far more quickly than Richard expected. By the time the final count was completed, the outcome was obvious. The chairman stood, cleared his throat, and announced the result. Richard Carter was removed from his executive position effective immediately. A wave of disbelief swept through the room. For years, Richard had been one of the most powerful people in the company. Now that authority disappeared in a single evening. His career wasn't ending because of a market crash. It wasn't ending because of poor performance. It wasn't ending because competitors defeated him. It was ending because he never truly understood who held power. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. He looked toward Olivia, searching for something, an explanation, a reaction, perhaps even mercy. Olivia gave him none. She simply stood quietly, watching, the same way she had watched for months, the same way she had watched while he lied. The same way she had watched while Melissa smiled and pretended to be a loyal friend. The same way she had watched while they planned a future built upon deception. Now the truth was speaking for itself, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. Then the chairman announced another decision, one that left Melissa completely stunned. An internal review regarding conflicts of interest and ethical violations would begin immediately. Pending that review, her role within the organization was terminated. Melissa's face went pale. The confidence she carried throughout the evening disappeared instantly. Around the ballroom, people began connecting the dots. The affair, the secret meetings, the leadership changes, the unusual decisions, the whispers that had circulated for months. Everything suddenly made sense. The people who once appeared untouchable now looked vulnerable, exposed, defeated, and yet Olivia still wasn't celebrating. Because this had never been about humiliation. It had never been about creating a public spectacle. It had been about restoring the truth. The truth about her marriage. The truth about her friendship. And the truth about a company that two people had spent years trying to control without ever realizing who truly owned it. As security quietly approached Richard and Melissa, many people expected Olivia to say something, to deliver a final speech, to make a dramatic statement. Instead, she remained silent. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't spoken. Sometimes the facts themselves say everything that needs to be said. And as Richard and Melissa prepared to leave the ballroom, surrounded by the very people they had once tried so hard to impress, they finally understood the reality of their situation. They hadn't lost everything in a single night. They had been losing it for months. They just hadn't known it. But the most surprising chapter of the story was still ahead. Because once the headlines spread, once the investigation expanded, and once former employees began speaking openly, Richard and Melissa would discover that losing their positions was only the beginning of their problems. Here's the final part, written as the conclusion and emotional payoff of the documentary story. In the days that followed, news of what happened at the gala spread faster than anyone expected. What began as whispers inside corporate circles quickly became public knowledge. Investors talked. Employees talked. Former executives talked. Soon, people who had never met Olivia Carter knew her story. Many assumed she would spend the following weeks celebrating. After everything Richard and Melissa had done, most people expected her to enjoy watching them fall. But Olivia surprised everyone. She did the exact opposite. While others focused on the scandal, Olivia focused on rebuilding. The company had endured months of uncertainty. Employees had spent too long wondering what the future would look like. Trust needed to be restored. Leadership needed stability. And for the first time in a very long time, decisions were being made by the person who actually owned the company. Several respected managers who had been pushed aside were invited back into leadership discussions. Departments that had struggled under unnecessary pressure were given support. Long-term plans were reviewed. Risky projects were reevaluated. The culture gradually began changing. Employees noticed the difference almost immediately. For years, many had viewed Olivia as a quiet figure connected to the company through history and family ties. Now they were seeing something else. They were seeing leadership. Real leadership. The kind that doesn't demand attention. The kind that earns it. Meanwhile, Richard and Melissa found themselves facing a reality neither had prepared for. They had spent years believing they were building a future together. Now they were trying to rebuild their reputations in a world that suddenly knew exactly who they were. Professional opportunities disappeared. Business relationships became distant. People who once eagerly returned their calls became difficult to reach. Investors showed little interest in listening to new proposals. Former supporters quietly moved on. For the first time in years, they were experiencing the consequences of decisions they believed would never catch up to them. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all was understanding that their downfall wasn't caused by bad luck. It wasn't caused by competitors. It wasn't caused by a sudden betrayal. It was caused by their own choices. Every lie, every secret, every act of deception, every moment they convinced themselves they were entitled to more than they had earned. Those choices created the future they now faced. Months later, a journalist asked Olivia a question many people had wondered about. The reporter wanted to know whether she felt satisfied, whether she considered what happened a victory, whether watching Richard and Melissa lose everything brought her happiness. Olivia thought carefully before answering. Then she said something that would later be quoted by countless people who heard her story. She said, "The greatest mistake people make is believing revenge is about destroying someone else. The truth is, the greatest victory is rebuilding yourself so completely that their betrayal no longer defines your life." It was a simple statement, but it captured everything. Because in the end, Olivia didn't win because Richard and Melissa lost. She won because she refused to become like them. She refused to let bitterness control her future. She refused to allow betrayal to determine the rest of her story. Instead, She chose something far more difficult. She chose to move forward. Years later, the company was stronger than ever. New opportunities emerged. New leaders rose through the organization. Scholarship programs created in honor of Olivia's late father helped young entrepreneurs pursue dreams they otherwise could not afford. Communities benefited. Employees prospered. The business continued growing. And through it all, one truth remained impossible to ignore. The people who thought they had all the power never actually understood where the power was. They saw titles. They saw influence. They saw money. But they overlooked something far more important: ownership, patience, character, and the quiet strength of a woman they underestimated from the very beginning. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson in this entire story. Sometimes the people who betray you believe they are taking everything from you. What they fail to realize is that if your value comes from your integrity, your resilience, and your ability to rebuild, then there is nothing they can truly take. Because those things cannot be stolen. And sometimes, the people who think they've won are simply standing at the beginning of a lesson they never expected to learn. So what do you think? If you discovered that your spouse and your closest friend had betrayed you for years, would you have exposed them immediately? Or would you have done what Olivia did and waited patiently until the truth revealed itself? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story kept you hooked until the very end, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story may be even more unbelievable than this one. Thank you for watching. And remember, never underestimate the quiet person in the room. They may know far more than anyone realizes.